So, was there anything that made you uncomfortable in the book that caused you to reflect in ways you hadn't before?
No, I was conscious of my several weaknesses. The big plus, of course, in respect of the period covered in the book with the Prime Ministership was that I'd given up the grog before I became Prime Minister, and I never had a drop the whole time I was Prime Minister. So that had been, in terms of the earlier book, the cause of some of my more gross stupidities. That was absent for this volume.
Blanche, you also quoted Graham Richardson in terms of, this was in the context of the 1984 election, that extremely long campaign for an early election, and you quote Graham Richardson on Bob going into that election. At that stage, Richardson is quoted as saying, "Hawke's ego was as big as all outdoors."
Yes. I think that's probably not inaccurate. He was Mr. 75%. I know everybody says that Kevin Rudd had the highest ratings of all time, but I don't think he was his ratings.
Yeah, I think it was more that it was the most sustained or something. But
yeah,
anyway.
yeah. Anyway, but certainly Bob had a huge sort of view of himself, let us say, and yeah.
Does it bother you to hear that, or can your ego handle it?
My ego is quite capable of handling that misrepresentation.
And he hears it from me all the time at home anyway.
Blanche, again, you quote staff, or you attribute to staff that they knew how highly strung Bob was going into the 1990 rematch with Andrew Peacock because of the perception that he'd lost the 84 debate, and that the staff in 1990 were conscious that Bob was highly strung going into that contest because of the perception that he'd lost the debate with Peacock in 84, and that election had started well but turned sour in 84. Bob, how do you handle that kind of criticism?
In 1984, it wasn't Bob Hawke fighting the 1984 election. I'd considered resigning. I had two massive problems. I went through the whole campaign in agony, literally in agony, because, as you remember, on the day of the campaign started, I got smashed in the eye with a cricket ball, and glass gone into my eye, and the doctors said if it had gone another fraction, I would have lost the sight of the eye. I was in absolute agony every day of that campaign, physically. And I had found out about my daughter being a heroin addict, and I felt shattered by that and my inadequacy as a parent. I tended to blame myself, probably too much and perhaps improperly in some senses, but nevertheless, those two things meant that I went through that campaign. It was another person, it wasn't Bob Hawke. I was absolutely confident in terms of 1990 that I'll be able to handle Andrew, and it was a unanimous consensus after the debate that it was all over.
So with Ros, again, Blanche touches in the book on the early problems with Ros, that she left home at 15, went off to live in Sydney with friends, and that at a particular point you actually went looking for her and you found her. What did you find?
Well, a somewhat frightened little girl. But Terry, I don't want to talk at great length or any detail much at all about Ros's problems, because she's with determination has fought the problem, and it has had an enormous impact on her life. And I, in consideration for her, she's alive and concerned. I really would prefer not to dwell on that.
Understood. But Blanche, you've said that Bob at one point that year was in the grip of depression.
Yes.
And actually contemplated suicide. How seriously?
Well, I don't know how seriously, but he told me he had contemplated suicide. He was so upset. But the extraordinary thing was he actually was suffering from depression, and none of the staff recognised it. Or if they did, they didn't put a name on it. And back in those days, people had depression and, tough.
I will ask you the suicide question. How seriously did you contemplate it?
Not seriously for long, but I at one moment I just had this utter depression that this beautiful child who was, devoted to me, and I to her, had reached a point of near death, and it just shook me. But as distinct from the analysis of some, including Paul and others who tried to say that I never recovered or took a long time to recover, I recovered from it reasonably quickly after the election.
How hard was it to concentrate on a brief? How hard was it to concentrate on issues? I think your view is that you suffered depression for about 6 weeks. Others amongst your close staff say, looking back, possibly longer. But even for that period that you identify.
It was very, very difficult. I was accustomed in all my professional life to that time, as an advocate for the ACU, as president of the ACU, and then as Prime Minister, I was accustomed to concentrating and bringing to bear my intelligence on the issue and make decisions which were appropriate to the challenge of that was confronting me. Now, when your mind is surging with these other emotions, by definition it's impossible to utilise that process which had been so compellingly successful for me in the past.
And there was a period there where you weren't telling any of you. I mean, everyone else around you was oblivious to what you were trying to deal with.
Yeah,
which
for a while.
Which must have made it very tough on both sides.
I think
He told Paul Keating and Peter Abels and a couple of others in the Jewish community because he knew he could rely on their discretion and their love of family and their love of him. And that was it, but didn't tell any. Oh, and you told Jean Sinclair, but didn't tell any of the rest of the staff. So they were all mystified as why is he behaving in this peculiar way.